we live in a world that in many ways has extremes. We have the right and we have the left, politically speaking. And it seems as though the right and the left can't talk to each other. They can't have relationships, or there's nothing that they can do to actually really work things out. We have fear of government shutdowns all the time. And it's becoming old news at this point. But we live in extremes. And one of the things that we talk about, particularly in the church, is the difference between light and dark. And we live in a world of darkness. And there is the moral darkness that we see in this world. And sometimes we see it in the extreme case scenario, things like terrorism or violence or extreme acts of violence. But we also see darkness in selfishness, of I went up my way, of I don't care about you. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and I'm going to get my way even at the expense of you. And so that's part of darkness. But we also have some, what we could call existential darkness, of darkness within, of things like grief or sadness or despair. And sometimes we can be filled with that type of darkness in our lives. And when you're in those moments, you can't see. You're consumed by that darkness in your life, of the despair, the frustrations, the anger, the grief, and of all other things as well. But this time of year, we just celebrated Christmas. And, Christmas, we're talking about the light of the world has come. And Jesus is the light. And God's response to the darkness in the world is to send Jesus. God's response to sin is to send Jesus. God's response to us rebelling against God is for God to send Jesus so that we might be reconciled to God. That is what God's response is to us. Now, as today we're going to be in three different passages. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 10, 1 John chapter 4, and John chapter 1. If you want to thumb through all those, that's fine. But we're going to start in Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 through 18 and 28. And Jesus is talking, and he says, look, I'm sending you as sheep among wolves. So be as shrewd as snakes and harmless as doves. But beware, for you will be handed over to the courts, and you will be whipped and flogged in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell the rulers and other unbelievers about me. Don't be afraid, in verse 28, he says, don't be afraid of those who want to kill you, for they can't touch your soul. Only fear God, who can destroy both body and soul in hell. So Jesus starts off by a warning. He is giving us a warning, telling us that he is sending us into hostile territory. Jesus, he's not holding any punches. He's not burying the lead. He's telling us, I'm sending you out into this world, and it's going to be difficult. You're going to face difficulties that Jesus couldn't even begin to explain to the people there to understand, that they were going to face frustrations and annoyances and dangerous situations. Jesus is telling us that following him is not for the weak. If you want to follow Jesus, it's going to take a lot. Now, I say that with a caveat. There are a lot of people that are trying to casually follow Jesus. Jesus is not talking about casually following him. Oh, Jesus is a good idea. I'll add Jesus to my life. Jesus is saying, if you really want to follow me, if you really want to be part of me, it's going to take all that you have. It's going to take all that you've got in your life. Now, but on some levels, we look at Jesus and we see that Jesus is in contrast to the rulers of the time. One of the rulers of the time was Herod. And Herod was seen as a ruler who ruled with tyranny and financial strength and military power and technological development. He ruled with those things. And Herod was a ruler that if somebody got in his way, he took care of them. Now, for us, that's kind of speaking innuendo, but for Herod, it wasn't. He literally killed people that got in his way. That's a little different world today than it was back then. But Herod was ruthless. And Jesus stands in contrast to the rulers of the world, because Jesus rules and leads by vulnerability, by solidarity, and what we usually call self-sacrifice. That's a common thing. We talk about Jesus in Mark chapter 10. It says, for the Son of Man, Jesus is saying that he came not to be served, but to serve. Jesus didn't come so people could raise him up. He came to serve us. He came to give his life for us. And he gives us this warning that we're going into hostile territory, but he tells us how we're to act. We're supposed to be shrewd and harmless at the same time. Now, some of you may like snakes. I don't. And I'm not saying that we need to eradicate all snakes in the world or exterminate them from the world, but I don't want a snake as a pet. And partially, particularly if it's a constrictor, I don't want a pet that the only thing it wants to do with me is squeeze the life out of me. If you like snakes, all the power to you. But Jesus is telling us to be crafty, to be sneaky, to do what we can to get ahead, but with integrity. And he says, be as harmless or innocent as doves. Now, if you're familiar with the church building, particularly if you've been down to the edge, the fellowship hall, you may say, I'm not sure if doves and pigeons are as innocent as we would like them to be sometimes, because they've been getting into our building and they leave a mark, to say the least. And they've been a pain in my existence the last several months. But the reality is, Jesus is calling us to live with integrity. That this is not about you getting ahead. Following Jesus is not about you putting yourself in a better position than somebody else so you gain the advantage. It's about you sharing Jesus with people. About doing all you can to make sure Jesus is at the forefront of who you are and what you do. So Jesus calls us to be vigilant, to make sure that we put forth the effort. Now, we're going to be put in dangerous situations, and on some level we can say the enemy is constantly attacking us, trying to get us off course, trying to trip us up, trying to convince us that Jesus is not worth following. And that's part of where our existential darkness comes from, the despair, the discouragement, the frustration of, is it worth it? It can be really easy to say no at times. Say, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to give my life to this. I don't want to continue to put forth my effort on this. But Jesus is not calling us to be paranoid. He's calling us to keep focused. Because we're going to face these difficulties. He makes it clear. You're going to face things that annoy you, that frustrate you. And that, on some level, that's part of life because we live in a fallen and broken world. Even if we're not talking about religious stuff, we live in a world where we're going to face disappointments. And in some ways, that's just part of life. But there may be times where God puts you in a difficult situation, or an uncomfortable situation, or even an unfair situation, and he does so because that is your opportunity to show Jesus to others. That's a hard pill to swallow if you're going through a difficult situation. Well, I'm so happy Jesus put this hardship in my life. Whew. It's really hard to praise Jesus through those moments. But what it does is it gives us the confidence that what I'm going through is worth it because Jesus can use this. Jesus can use this for his glory, for his purposes, and he can change lives through him. Now, Jesus, if we look throughout history, Jesus is one of, if not the most influential person that's ever existed. Now, whether you are religious or not, people know who Jesus is. And they at least somewhat know some of his ideas. Some of them may, and turn the other cheek is a common one that people who don't really know anything about Jesus love to talk about. But Jesus is influential. And if you look through how the first few centuries went, when Christianity was forming and trying to figure out what it was, there was some conflict with the Jews at the time. And the conflict wasn't a moral issue, or there weren't ethical issues that they were dealing with. It was trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? Because the issue was not that Jews were becoming Christians. The main issue was that pagans or non-religious people were becoming Christians. And the issue is that this threatened the status quo for the Jews, because the Jews had a pretty sweet agreement with the Romans at the time. Because Jews had a lot of exemptions that most everybody else didn't have. They didn't have to make sacrifices to the emperor. They didn't have to serve in the military because they were Jews. And so now, because Jews were ethnically Jews, there was a lineage and genealogy that they had to keep in order to maintain their Jewish status. That was easy to track. But now we have these non-Jewish people coming in to be Christians, and it's going to kind of distort the relationship. And so now if everybody could come into be a follower of Jesus and claim all these exemptions that the Jews had, the Roman government would have stepped in and said, no, we can't do this anymore. The Jews didn't like that. That was nerve-wracking. It made them uncomfortable. And when we're uncomfortable, we don't like to remain the same. When we're uncomfortable, we want to fix the problem. Some of you today might be uncomfortable because the temperature is not what you want. And the fun thing is, some of you may be hot and some of you may be cold, and you'll both submit complaints, right? Now, nobody really talks to me about that much. But when we talk about cold and heat, we have two contrasting things. And the reality is, though, cold doesn't exist. Cold is the absence of heat. So you can't measure cold. It's not like, oh, it's cold to this level. Like heat, we measure. It's this hot, and it can go up or down. Cold, we can't measure. And so sometimes I think that's where we get into trouble of we have these contrasting views or ideas, but one we can't measure, or one isn't a thing. It's just the absence of the other thing. And so Jesus is calling us to be his followers, and if we're not his followers, then we are absent of Jesus. But I want to continue go to 1 John chapter 4, verses 15 through 19, where the author writes, "Those, all who declare that Jesus is the Son of God, have God living in them, and they live in God. We know how much God loves us, and we have put our trust in him. God is love. All who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And as we live in God, our love grows more perfect. So we will not have to be afraid on Judgment Day, but we can face him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. Such love has no fear, for perfect love expels fear. If we are afraid, it is for fear of punishment, and this shows that we have not fully experienced his perfect love. We love each other because God first loved us." So 1 John here is telling us, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, to be a true follower of God? It means that we understand and identify who Jesus is. We believe in who Jesus is. Following Jesus is not limited to saying a few sentences of forgiveness, of repentance. It's about believing and knowing who Jesus is. That's what we have to do. Because we know John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever knows all these facts about Jesus, for those who go to church so often, for those who give money to the church, for those who do good. No, it's for whoever believes in Jesus. Now, the belief in Jesus should change us. It moves us. It gives us instructions of what it means to live our life. Because if we live as Jesus lives, then we can have confidence. But if we don't live as Jesus lived, we will not have confidence. We have anxiety, worry, and frustration. But again, coming back to the Jews and the early church, the issue was in identifying who Jesus is. Because in many ways, Christians and Jews at the time were pretty similar. Their moral and ethical issues, they were kind of in agreement with each other. The issue was that they differed on who Jesus is. And because all these non-Jews were coming in to believe who Jesus is, it was giving some skepticism to the Jewish leadership of, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to fix this? Now, in today's modern scholarship, whether there's religious or non-religious affiliation, modern scholars have a view of Jesus. There's pretty much consensus that Jesus was a historical person, that he existed. And so the question is not, did he exist? The question is, who is Jesus? That's the question we have to answer. And I wonder how many people view Jesus as, well, he was a good guy, or he's a morally good person, or he gave us some good things to think about to help us be better people in this world. See, 1 John says, all who declare that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is who he said he is, that Jesus is who the Bible said he is, if we believe in that and confess that, then we have God living in us. But I wonder how many people claim to be followers of Jesus, but don't really fully believe in Jesus. And when I say don't really fully believe in Jesus, well, we believe in the idea of Jesus, or we like the concept of Jesus, or we think Jesus is something good to add to our lives, but he won't be central in our lives. How many people try to follow Jesus and other things in this world? See, when we don't rely on Jesus, we're probably going to be disappointed in religion. That's what's going to happen. But if we rely on Jesus, if we give up ourselves completely to Jesus, then it's going to change our lives, and then we can receive the love of God like never before. See, we live in a world that has darkness in it. And we're not perfect, and I'm not trying to say followers of Jesus are perfect. But the light of Jesus is coming into us to change us, and God calls us to go out and fight the darkness. Now, I say fight the darkness. We're not being mean, fighting dirty. He calls us to be as harmless or innocent as doves, to be pure, to be people who want the best for others, to give of our lives to them, because we are not called to serve ourselves. We are called to serve others. Now, I like the concept that you can't fight fire with fire. You can't drive out darkness with darkness. Or you remember Martin Luther King Jr., you can't drive out hate with hate. Only love can do that. See, if followers of Jesus go out into the world and try to drive out darkness with hate, it's just going to create more darkness. It's going to create more non-Jesus stuff. But we can go out into this world with the love of Jesus and have complete confidence because of who Jesus is and who he has called us to be. Now, this confidence is not to be confused with arrogance. If we go out with arrogance, people are going to see that. If you go out into this world and trying to tell people that they're wrong, that they're bad people, they're not going to trust you. It's because that's not the point. Jesus is not calling us to go out into the world to condemn the world, because that's not what Jesus did. He calls us to go out into the world to love the world. And I don't love the world or anybody else because they deserve it. I love because he first loved me. Now, I don't deserve love. Romans 5:8, God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. While we were still rejecting God, God sent Jesus so that we might be reconciled to him. See, my call is not to go out into this world and just spread goodness just because, to be altruistic. My call is to go out into the world and to spread the love of Jesus. So that when people see me, they should see Jesus. They should see something different than they see in somebody else. I don't deserve God's love, but neither does anybody else. See, I love the concept of when Jesus was on the cross, that he emptied himself of all but love. If we look at the cross, we see a lot of violence there. We see a lot of wrath and anger, but it wasn't those things that were on display with Jesus. It was his love that was on display for us. He showed his love by the sacrifice that he gave for us. He lowered himself. He became nobody so that we might believe in him and experience God's love. Now, if we look at Jesus, and particularly if we're talking about the early church with the Jewish leadership and the Christianity of trying to figure this out, Jesus was not ethnically pure. We look at his genealogy, and he has a lot of non-Israelite, a lot of non-Jewish heritage in there. He's got some Egyptian, Moabite, Persia. There's some incest type stuff in there. There's adultery. It's not a squeaky clean genealogy for Jesus, which shows that Jesus came for everybody. That you don't have to be squeaky clean before you come to Jesus. You don't have to, it's like, when you take a shower, you don't get clean before you take a shower. You take a shower to get clean. You don't have to get clean before you come to Jesus. You just have to come to Jesus and he will clean you. But as I've been talking about light and dark, we see these are contrasting things. Now, you may have noticed when I talked about heat and cold, I said cold is not a thing, it's just the absence of heat. In the same way, darkness is not a thing, it's just the absence of light. We measure the amount of light, and sometimes we call it darkness. But it's really about how much light there is or there isn't present in our current situation. But there's various levels of light. And some of our light, we have light in here, and it's nice. It's nice. We can see, we can walk around. And the great thing is, for most of us, we go through life always having a flashlight. I remember growing up, we didn't always have flashlights or the batteries were out, but we always have a flashlight, don't we? And we can turn on our flashlight and we can find things. But the reality is, I can shine my light at you right now, and you can see it. I can shine it in my face. This isn't super pleasant, but it's not going to illuminate much. But Jesus doesn't call us to illuminate all things, but he does call us to be the light. And our light can grow. And so I've got this flashlight here, and this flashlight is super bright. So you can see, I can still, I'm not going to shine in anybody's eyes. If you can look out in the hallway there, you can see the light back there. I can stand at my house at night. I'm sorry, I did shine in some people's eyes there. And shine it on the church, and it's pretty cool, even with the crazy bright light out there. But the reality is, so Jesus calls us, and it turns on weird some ways. I don't know how to turn it off sometimes. But Jesus calls us to be the light, and he calls our light to grow. And our light grows not because we want it to, not because we're better than anybody else, but because we allow more Jesus into our lives. And the more Jesus we allow into our lives, the more Jesus comes out. But some people are just content with, we're a little light. People can see something, but what does it mean for you to shine brightly so it illuminates everything? We come to John chapter 1, verse 5. It says, talking about Jesus, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. See, the battery on my phone or the flashlight, they'll eventually wear out, need to be recharged. But the light of Jesus will never fade. It will never wear out. And so Jesus came into this world. This world is a dark world, but that's not to say that the world is morally bad. When we talk about darkness, it's not about condemning somebody else or saying they're bad. Darkness is in contrast to Jesus. See, we have the light and the dark. We have Jesus and we have other things. And so the darkness is in contrast to who Jesus is. And Jesus came to show us God's love and to be the light of God. And he stands in contrast to the world. We know John 3:16, but I love verse 17. It says Jesus came into the world not to condemn the world, but to save the world. Jesus didn't come to make you feel bad about yourself. So if you go out into this world making people feel bad about themselves because they're not living the life Jesus has called them to live, then you're not following Jesus. Jesus calls you to a different life. He says you can have something better. You can walk into the light. You do not have to be consumed by darkness. But part of what happens is when we're living in the dark is it's hard to see. And it's hard to have confidence. Now, you may be able to walk around your house when it's dark, but have you ever left something out where you didn't remember you put it and you're walking in the dark? That's always super fun. Have you ever been walking in the dark and stepped on a Lego with your bare foot? That's a lot of fun. Real hard to be Jesus in that moment, isn't it? But see, we run into those things because we don't have the light. But Jesus gives us the light so we can see, so we can walk in this world with confidence because of who Jesus is and what he has done for us. And I just love that verse. John chapter 1, verse 5. The darkness can never extinguish the light. I hope we remember that. I hope we come back to that because this is the darkest time of year, right? We just had the winter solstice a week and a half ago. The days are super short, and it's been foggy and cloudy here. We haven't seen the sun in days. But Jesus came to be the light. And so during the darkest time of year, we in the Northern Hemisphere celebrate that the light has come and the darkness can never extinguish the light. But here's what I want you to know today, is that you are part of God's plan. Each and every one of us, we all are part of God's plan. God doesn't need you. He doesn't need me. He doesn't need any of us, but he chooses to work through us. God invites you to participate with him in his plan of redemption in this world. You specifically. Now, you're not trying to put you on a pedestal here, but to recognize that you have a plan, that you have a purpose, that God's plan is you. It's us. So I do want to ask you, are you bringing darkness into this world, or are you bringing light to the world? Which are you allowing to grow? Because if you're not bringing light, you're bringing darkness. You say, well, I'm doing better than other people. Well, that may be true, but are you actually living the life Jesus has called you to live? Do you go out into this world with attitudes and characteristics of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control? Or do you go out into this world of selfishness, of pride, of indifference, of arrogance? What does your life display? Does it display Jesus, or does it display yourself? Because God chooses you. He wants to work through you. You are part of his plan, but he doesn't force you to. We can inhabit God's story to go out into this world of darkness to bring the light of Jesus, or we can continue just to dwell in our own desires, our own selfishness, our own pride. And this brings me to the question of what is evil? Because this is a very uncomfortable word. Nobody wants to be called evil. I don't want to be called evil. You don't want to be called evil. But if we use evil and we say the antonym is that of holiness, of purity, evil is anything that's contrary to Jesus. Evil is anything that's not Jesus. Now again, we're not speaking derogatory towards the world or towards those who do not know Jesus, but to recognize that Jesus came to change us, to call us to a different way. And before Jesus, we were living contrary to Jesus, which we can define in ways that aren't super pleasant. But one thing we have to wrap our minds around is, who is Jesus? Because Jesus is the Messiah. He may not be the Messiah that you wanted, but he's the Messiah you need. This is the good news that will bring great joy to all the people. The Savior is here. Jesus is here. He has come so that darkness does not have to be our end. And a lot of people missed Jesus when he was born and when he lived because they were looking for a different Messiah. Jesus didn't fulfill their expectations. And so the question is, are you looking for Jesus, or are you looking for your own expectations to be met? Are you living in the light of Jesus, or are you trying to fit Jesus into your idea of what it means to live in this world? Are you living in the light, or are you living in the darkness? That's your question. If we're living in the light of Jesus, nothing can overcome it. Because the darkness can never extinguish the light. So as we end 2024 and go into 2025, maybe it's cliche, but the challenge is to be the light. What does it mean for you to be the light of Jesus? What does it mean for you to go into your workplace tomorrow and have an attitude of Jesus? Because some of you go have workplaces that really bring you down. That is a negative atmosphere. Now, maybe you don't. Maybe you have an optimistic place, and I hope you do. But whether your situation is good or it's unpleasant, what does it mean for you to be Jesus in those situations? What does it mean for you to be the light? And how would that happen? What does that look like as we enter into this new year?